The explosion didn't start with sound. It started with light. A white flash beneath the black SUV, sharp and clean, like a camera going off at the edge of my vision. Then the air folded in on itself, and the world went sideways. 1 second, I was stacking dirty glasses on a tray behind the patio railing of Hans Pearl. The next, I was on top of a man I barely knew. My arms locked around his chest, my belly crushed between us, and fire eating the sky above our heads. I didn't do it because I'm brave. I need that to be clear. I did it because something in my body recognized the danger before my brain did. And it decided, without asking me, that I was going to move. So I moved, toward him, into the blast. And the only thought I had as the heat swallowed the sidewalk was not about him, it was about her. My daughter, the one still growing inside me. 7 months. I was 7 months pregnant the night I threw myself over a man whose name I didn't even know. To me, he was just table 12, the man in the dark navy suit who came in 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, always a back corner, always alone. Except he was never really alone. There were always men, 2 or 3 of them, posted by the door or seated at the bar pretending to be customers. They watched everyone, watched the exits, watched the staff. He never ordered from the menu. The chef would just, no. The food would arrive, and he wouldn't touch it until someone at the bar tasted it first. I noticed that the second time I served him, he never smiled, never made small talk, never looked at me for more than the half second it took to nod when I set his plate down. The tips were always cash, always too much, folded once, slid under the rim of his water glass, like even generosity was something he needed to keep at arm's length. I didn't know what he was. I didn't know the name Kang Min Jae. I didn't know what the Kang Syndicate meant on the streets of this city. I just knew he was a man who carried silence like a weapon, and that something about the way he sat, still, controlled, coiled, made the air around him heavier than it should have been. That night, he stepped outside to take a phone call. I followed a minute later to bust the patio table near the door, the one with the 2 empty soju glasses his men had left behind. The SUV was idling at the curb, black, tinted, engine running. And that's when I saw it, a small light, underneath the chassis, blinking, steady, rhythmic. Too deliberate to be a reflection, too precise to be nothing. My hand stopped moving. The tray tilted. A glass slid off and shattered on the concrete. He turned at the sound, looked at me, then looked at the car. And I watched his face change, just barely, just for a fraction of a breath, into something I had never seen on a man like him before. Recognition. Not of me, of death. He knew what it was. I could see it. He knew, and his body locked, just for a heartbeat. Just long enough. I don't know why I didn't run. I don't know why, with a baby inside me and nothing in my bank account, and no one in this city who would notice if I disappeared, I didn't turn and go the other way. But I didn't. I dropped the tray. I crossed the 3 steps between us. I grabbed the lapels of his suit and pulled him sideways, hard, away from the car, and I wrapped my body around his like I could stop what was already coming. The blast hit us from behind. Glass turned into rain. The heat bit through my uniform, and the ground came up fast. When it was over, when the ringing started, and the smoke rolled in thick, and the car was just a skeleton of orange flame, I was on top of him, shaking, bleeding from somewhere I couldn't feel, and he was staring up at me. Not with gratitude, not with shock, with something colder, something sharper. Like I had just broken a rule he didn't know existed. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask if I was okay. He said one word. Why? And I didn't have an answer. I still don't. All I know is that on a Tuesday night in October, outside a restaurant that paid me $11 an hour, I chose to save a man the world was trying to kill. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his sins. I didn't know the war I had just walked into. But he knew. And what he did next, because of what I did that night, is the reason I'm telling you this story. Before we get into what happened next, and trust me, you are not ready for where this story goes, drop a comment right now. Would you have moved toward the blast or away from it? Be honest. People always ask me when I decided to do it. Like there was a moment, a calculation. Some noble little voice in my head that whispered, "Save him." There wasn't. What there was, and I've replayed it so many times now the memory has edges worn smooth, was a flash. Small. White-blue. The kind of light that doesn't belong underneath a car at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. I was 3 steps behind him, tray in my hands. 2 empty soju glasses and a crumpled napkin. The patio smelled like sesame and exhaust. He was walking toward the SUV, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand reaching for the rear door handle. His driver was already inside, engine running. And that light pulsed again. Underneath the chassis, steady, patient, like it was counting down to something only it understood. My body didn't ask permission. It just went. The tray left my hands. I don't remember dropping it. I heard it hit the concrete somewhere behind me, a crash of glass that made him turn. And in that half-second where his eyes found mine, where his hand froze on the door handle and his brow creased like I was a problem he hadn't accounted for, I closed the gap. 3 steps, maybe less. I grabbed his jacket, both fists. The fabric was expensive. I remember that stupidly. Smooth and heavy under my fingers, like it cost more than my rent. I yanked him sideways, hard, away from the car, and my body folded over his as we went down. My belly hit his ribs, my chin cracked against his shoulder, and I held on. Not because I was brave, not because I had a plan. I held on because holding on is what I've always done. When my mother was dying and I was 17, and there was no one else to sit in that room. When the bills came and I worked doubles until my feet bled through my socks. When the father of my child walked out, and I didn't flinch. Not once. Not in front of him. Because flinching is a luxury for people who have someone to catch them. I am not wired for heroism. I am wired for survival. And sometimes survival looks like throwing yourself over a stranger because your hands decided before your head did. The blast came a half-second later, and after that, the world stopped making sense for a while. When it started again, when the ringing dulled enough to hear my own breathing and the smoke wasn't so thick I could taste it, I was still on top of him. My arms locked, my whole body trembling like a current was running through it. He moved first, not gently. He pushed me off, firm, almost clinical, like removing debris. I rolled onto the sidewalk, and the concrete was warm beneath me, heated by the blast, I realized later. He stood, slowly, brushed something, glass, ash, I don't know, from his sleeve, reached up and buttoned his jacket. The top button was gone, ripped clean off. But he buttoned the second one, precise and steady, like he was leaving a business dinner. His face gave me nothing. Absolutely nothing. A wall of composure so practiced, it looked almost bored. But his hands, I saw his hands. The left one, hanging at his side, the fingers were trembling. A fine, rapid vibration, like a struck tuning fork. He noticed me noticing, and he slid that hand into his pocket without breaking eye contact. No thank you. No are you okay. No rush to help me up. Just those cold, quiet eyes, scanning me the way his men scanned rooms, evaluating, calculating, trying to solve a problem he hadn't expected to encounter. A pregnant woman on the ground, bleeding from the ear, shaking, alive. He looked at me like I had insulted him. And maybe I had. Maybe in his world, what I did wasn't a kindness. Maybe it was a complication, an unpaid debt, a loose thread in a life where every thread is accounted for. He turned away, and his men were coming now, pouring from a second vehicle, shouting in Korean, guns drawn. One of them grabbed his arm. He shrugged it off without looking, and I stayed on that sidewalk, hands on my belly, feeling her kick, hard, angry, alive, against my palms. He never looked back, but I saw it. Before he turned, before the mask locked back into place, something fractured behind his eyes, something he didn't want me to see. And I knew, even then, that whatever had just happened between us wasn't over. It was just beginning. The front windows of Hans Pearl were gone, just gone. Where there had been glass, there were now jagged mouths gaping at the street, smoke curling through them like the building was exhaling its last breath. Inside, tables were overturned. A wine bottle had rolled off the bar and shattered on the tile, and the red pooled across the floor in a way that made one of the sous chefs scream before he realized it wasn't blood. Sirens. Somewhere distant, then closer, then everywhere, layering on top of each other like a sound that doesn't know how to stop. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember moving from the sidewalk to the curb. But that's where I was, sitting on the edge of it, arms wrapped around my belly, rocking. Not consciously. My body was just doing it, the way you rock a child. Except the child was still inside me, and I didn't know yet if she was okay. That was the worst part. Not the blood drying on my ear, not the ringing that turned every voice into something underwater. The not knowing. Those seconds, God, they stretched like hours, where I sat there with my hands pressed against my stomach, waiting to feel her move. Wasn't she didn't. She didn't. And the world kept burning around me, but all I could hear was silence where her kick should have been. A paramedic knelt in front of me, young guy, couldn't have been more than 25. His hands were steady, but his eyes were wide. The kind of wide that told me he hadn't seen something like this before. He said things I didn't fully hear, asked me questions. How far along? Any pain? Any cramping? I answered on autopilot. 7 months. I don't know. Please just check her. He pressed the Doppler against my belly, cold gel on warm skin. And for 3 seconds, that could have been my entire life. There was nothing. Then, there. A heartbeat. Fast. Strong. Angry, almost. Like she was furious at the world for shaking her house. I broke. Not loud, not dramatic. I just folded forward over my own stomach and pressed my forehead against my knees and let the sob come out in one long, ugly, shaking breath. She was alive. My girl was alive. Across the street, and I didn't see this then, I only learned it later. Kang Min-jae was standing beside a black sedan. His men surrounded him. One had a hand on his shoulder, trying to guide him into the back seat. Another was on the phone, speaking rapid Korean, voice tight with urgency. He wasn't listening to any of them. He was watching me. He watched the paramedic kneel, watched the Doppler press against my belly, watched my face as I waited. And when I collapsed with relief, when my body gave way to the news that my daughter was still breathing, something moved across his face. Not softness, not pity. Something older than both. Something he didn't have a name for and didn't want. His lieutenant said his name. Twice. 3 times. He didn't answer. He just stood there on the other side of a burning street and watched a woman he'd never spoken to cry over an unborn child she'd almost lost, saving his life. Then he got into the car, pulled the door shut himself, said nothing. But his driver told me, months later, when all of this was over, that Min-jae didn't look at his phone, didn't speak to his men, didn't close his eyes. He turned in his seat and watched me through the rear window, the whole drive, until the street disappeared behind them, and I was just a shape in the smoke. And even then, he didn't turn around. He just sat there, still, quiet, like a man trying to remember how to feel something he'd spent 20 years learning to kill. I wasn't there for what happened next, but I've been told enough, by people who were, to know exactly how it went. 2 hours after the explosion, while I was still sitting in a hospital bed with monitors strapped to my belly and a nurse checking my blood pressure every 15 minutes, Kang Min-jae walked down a narrow staircase beneath a Koreatown barbecue restaurant on the west side of the city. The kind of place that smells like charcoal and soy at street level, but turns into something else entirely once you go below. Concrete walls, no windows, a single fluorescent light that buzzed like it was thinking about dying, the kind of room where conversations happen that never happened. 3 people were already seated at the table when he entered. Seo Junho, his second-in-command, his oldest friend, if a man like Min-jae uses that word. They came up together in Busan, ran the same streets as teenagers, bled for each other before either of them had anything worth protecting. Junho was loud that night, pacing, slamming his palm on the table, talking about retaliation, about sending a message, about burning down whoever was responsible and salting the ground behind them. His anger filled the room the way anger does when it needs to be seen. Park Yuna. Intelligence. The one who found things other people buried. She sat still, legs crossed, phone in her lap, already running traces on the explosive components. She didn't speak unless she had something worth saying. That night, she had nothing yet. So she watched, the way a surgeon watches before cutting. Baek Dong-sik, muscle, built like a wall and roughly as complex, a loyal in the way a dog is loyal, completely, without question, and without the capacity to imagine betrayal. He sat with his arms folded, cracking his knuckles one at a time, waiting to be pointed in a direction. Min-jae sat at the head of the table and said nothing for a long time. The bomb, Yuna would later confirm, was professional. C4 compound, timer triggered, not remote. Placed directly beneath the driver's side rear door, his door. Whoever built it knew which seat he sat in. Whoever planted it knew exactly when he would leave the restaurant. Not approximately. Exactly. This was not an outsider's work. This was someone with access. Someone in the room, or close enough to it, that the difference didn't matter. Min-jae listened to Junho's fury, watched Yuna's stillness, noted the rhythm of Dong-sik's knuckles, and then he spoke, not about the bomb, not about retaliation, not about any of the things they expected. He said, "The waitress, find out everything about her." The room stopped. Junho's mouth opened, then closed. Yuna's fingers paused over her phone. Dong-sik's knuckles went quiet. No one asked why. You don't ask Min-jae why. But the confusion hung in the air like a fourth body at the table. Heavy, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. A pregnant waitress had just done what none of them had. And the most dangerous man in the room didn't want to talk about the bomb. He wanted to talk about her. Yuna worked fast. She always did. Within 48 hours, a file landed on Min-jae's desk. A real desk, in a real office, above a shipping company in Chinatown that laundered nothing but actually made decent money moving freight. The file was thin. My life, it turns out, doesn't take many pages to summarize. Mitchell Renee Thompson, born August 14th, Southside, Chicago. Mother, Grace Elaine Thompson, deceased. Father, unlisted. No siblings. No criminal record. No debts and collections. Not because I'd paid them, but because no one extends credit to a woman with nothing to collateral. Current employment, waitress, Han's Pearl Korean restaurant. Current residence, Studio apartment, Rogers Park. Rent. Late twice in the past 4 months. Emergency contact. None. That last part. I imagine that's the one that sat with him. Not because it's dramatic, because it's ordinary. Because a woman with no emergency contact is a woman the world has already decided doesn't matter. But Yuna didn't stop at the surface. That wasn't her way. She traced my mother. Oh, and that's where the ground shifted beneath Kang Min-jae's feet. Grace Thompson, my mama, spent 11 years as a live-in housekeeper for a Korean family on the north side of Chicago. The Yoons, not wealthy in the way Min-jae was wealthy, but comfortable, connected. Mr. Yoon had cultural ties back to Seoul, old family networks, academic circles, the kind of Korean diaspora infrastructure that doesn't make headlines, but holds communities together. Mrs. Yoon ran the kitchen like it was a country, and my mother was her right hand. I grew up in that house. Not officially. We had our own small apartment in the back, but in every way that mattered. I ate dinner at their table. I learned to make kimchi jjigae, standing on a step stool beside Mrs. Yoon while she corrected my knife work. And I spoke Korean before I learned my multiplication tables. Not fluently, conversationally. Enough to understand the rhythm of a language that felt, for a long time, more like home than English did. The Yoons had a daughter, 3 years older than me, quiet, kind. She used to braid my hair on the back porch while we listened to her mother sing trot songs through the kitchen window. Her name was Sua, and I called her Uni, older sister, until the day my mother got sick, and we left that house for good. I was 12. I never saw Sua again. Her married name, and I wouldn't learn this until a man I barely knew sat me down on a park bench weeks later, was Kang Sua. She married him. The man on the sidewalk, the man in the Navy suit, the man I pulled to the ground while a car burned 3 feet away. I didn't know. I swear on my daughter's life, I didn't know. But Min-jae, sitting in that office, holding that file, he knew. Yuna had laid it out clean. The housekeeper's daughter, his dead wife's childhood friend. The woman who called Sua Unni and hadn't spoken her name in 16 years had just thrown herself over his body, without knowing who he was. He stared at that file for a long time. That's what Yuna told me later. She said she'd seen him read death warrants faster. She said she'd watched him sign away men's lives with less hesitation than he gave to that single manila folder. For the first time in years, maybe longer, Kang Min-jae did not know what to do. The universe had just drawn a line between his dead wife's past and a stranger's sacrifice. And the line ran straight through a woman he owed a debt he hadn't asked for and couldn't repay. He closed the file, set it on the desk, and sat in the silence for a very long time. I didn't learn about this part until much later. Yuna told me some of it. The driver filled in the rest. And the pieces I couldn't get from either of them, I built from the silence Min-jae left behind. Because sometimes, what a man doesn't say tells you more than what he does. The morning after he read my file, he drove to Rose Hill Cemetery. Alone. No security. No driver. Just him and a black umbrella he never opened, even though the rain came down steady and cold and turned the headstones dark. His wife's grave was simple, a flat stone marker. No statue, no ornament. Just her name, Kang Sua, and 2 dates that were too close together. And she died at 39. Lymphoma. The kind that moves slow enough to let you hope and fast enough to make the hope a cruelty. He stood there for a long time, didn't kneel, didn't pray. Just stood with his hands at his sides and the rain soaking through his coat, staring at her name like he was waiting for it to say something back. I think that's where the memories came, the ones he'd spent years pressing down into the basement of himself and locking the door. Sua sitting across from him at their kitchen table, asking him, not for the first time, not for the last, to leave, to walk away from the syndicate, to choose her, to choose quiet. He could hear it, I imagine. That voice, steady and sad and tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the illness, because it had been there long before the diagnosis. She wasn't afraid of the violence. She was afraid of what it was making him. And he looked at her and said no. Not cruelly, not loudly, just no. The way a man says no when he's already decided the question doesn't deserve an answer. She died 18 months later, and he buried the guilt in the same concrete he buried everything else. Deep, silent, load-bearing. It held the structure of him together. It became the structure. Now the universe had sent him a pregnant woman with her mother's kindness and Sua's name in her mouth, and the concrete was cracking. His men gave him 3 options: pay her off, clean, fast, forgotten. Junho pushed hardest for that, stood in his office with his arms crossed, and said the words with the confidence of a man who has never owed anyone anything he couldn't settle in cash. She's nobody. Pay her. Move on. Bring her under protection. Dangerous, because proximity to Minjae's world wasn't a shield. It was a sentence, or do nothing. Walk away. Let the debt live inside him unpaid, the way debts do when you're too proud to settle them and too haunted to forget. He left the cemetery with the rain still falling, and his coat heavy, and his shoes ruined, and no decision made. But something had shifted. I know this because of what came next. Because a man who had killed without hesitation, who had ended lives the way other men end phone calls, quickly, cleanly, and without looking back, was now paralyzed. Not by fear, not by danger, by a debt that had a heartbeat. 2 heartbeats, if you counted mine. And somewhere in the rain, walking back to his car with Sua's grave behind him, I think he heard her voice one more time. Not the words, just the tone, that quiet, steady, unbreakable sadness, asking him, again, to choose differently. I went back to work 3 days later, not because I was ready, because ready is a word for people with savings accounts and someone to call when the rent is due. I had neither. I had a bruised rib, a bandage behind my left ear, and a baby who needed me to keep standing. So I stood. I walked into Hans Pearl at 4:15 for the evening shift, tied my apron on in the hallway, went to my locker, and stopped. It was empty. Not stripped. Relocated. My things had been moved to a smaller locker near the manager's office, the one they used for the hostess who only worked weekends. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty shelf, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. The manager, Mr. Park, a nervous man who sweated through his collar whenever anything deviated from routine, appeared beside me like he'd been waiting. He wouldn't look me in the eyes. He said I'd been reassigned. Lighter duties. No more patio. No more heavy trays. I'd be working the front podium, seating guests, answering the phone. Same hours, same pay. I asked why. He wiped his forehead and said, "It's just better this way." The way a man says something when the words aren't his. I let it go. I didn't have the energy to fight it. I worked the podium that night with my ribs aching every time I reached for a menu, and my mind circling a question I couldn't land on. Then the calls started. First, the hospital. I'd been bracing for that bill the way you brace for a wave. Eyes shut, jaw tight, hoping it doesn't pull you under. 7 months pregnant, uninsured, an ER visit with monitoring, and an ultrasound and blood work. I knew what that would cost. I'd already started calculating which bills I'd skip to cover it. The billing department called to tell me my balance was 0, paid in full. They couldn't tell me by whom. Anonymous, they said, like that was supposed to be comforting. Then my landlord, a man who had never once called me about anything that wasn't a complaint or a threat. He left a voicemail, awkward, almost confused, saying my rent had been covered through the next 6 months, prepaid. He didn't know by who either, or he did, and he'd been told not to say. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time after that call. And then the groceries, a paper bag, brown, no label, left outside my apartment door sometime between my shift ending and me climbing the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. I carried it inside and unpacked it on the counter, and that's when my hands went still. Gochugaru, dried rice cakes, fish cakes, scallions, and a bottle of sesame oil, a Togi brand, the one with the yellow label, the exact brand my mother used to buy, the one Mrs. Yoon insisted on, the one I hadn't seen in a kitchen since I was 12 years old. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a message. Someone knew me, not the version of me that waited tables and paid rent late and sat alone in waiting rooms. The version of me that stood on a step stool in a warm kitchen and learned to cook in a language that wasn't hers. The version I hadn't told anyone about. I put the sesame oil down on the counter and stepped back. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from something worse. Someone was protecting me. Quietly, deliberately, without asking permission. And I didn't know how to live inside that. I had spent 28 years building a life on the certainty that no one was coming, that whatever I needed, I would get myself, or I would go without. That was the deal. That was the architecture. And now someone I couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't confront, was dismantling it one silent gesture at a time. I locked the door, sat on the kitchen floor, put my hands on my belly, and for the first time since the explosion, I was truly afraid. Not of whoever was watching, of how badly I wanted to let them. Yuna found it on a Thursday, a serial number, etched into a fragment of the timer housing that survived the blast, barely, just a partial string of digits baked into warped metal. She ran it through her channels, military-grade suppliers, black market procurement chains, the kind of network that doesn't show up on any database a civilian could access. The component traced back to a single supplier based in Incheon, a man named Huang, and Huang only sold to one client network on the American side, Junho's. Yuna brought it to Minjae without commentary. She set the report on his desk, stood with her hands clasped behind her back, and waited. She told me later she expected fury, expected the room to go cold the way it always did before Minjae gave an order that ended someone's story. Instead, he read it, set it down, and said, "Make a reservation. 2, somewhere quiet." He took Junho to dinner, not to the concrete room beneath Koreatown, not to an interrogation, to a restaurant, a small Japanese place in Lincoln Park, the kind with paper lanterns and low wooden tables, and a chef who didn't look up when they walked in. Minjae chose it deliberately. Neutral ground, a place with no history between them. They sat across from each other, ordered, ate, and for nearly 40 minutes, neither man said a word. I try to imagine that silence. 2 men who had bled together in Busan, who had built an empire from street corners and fear and the kind of loyalty that only exists between people who've seen each other at their worst. 20 years, more than half their adult lives. Sitting across a table with sashimi between them and the truth underneath it, and neither one willing to be the first to reach down. Minjae broke it, not with an accusation, not with evidence. He set his chopsticks down, looked at Junho, and asked a question that had nothing to do with bombs. "When did you stop trusting me?" And Junho, the man who'd pounded tables and demanded blood and pointed fingers at phantoms for 2 weeks, came apart. Not with violence, with grief. His face folded, his shoulders dropped, and the words came out broken and wet, like something he'd been drowning in. He was being pushed out. He could feel it. Chicago was Min-jae's new beginning, and there was no room for him in it. He didn't want Min-jae dead. He wanted Min-jae afraid. Afraid enough to pull him close again. The bomb was supposed to go off after he'd left the car. A warning. A scare. The timer malfunctioned. It detonated early. And a pregnant woman almost died because a grown man couldn't say the words. "I'm afraid you don't need me anymore," Junho wept. Openly. Ugly. The kind of crying that strips a man down to the child he used to be. Min-jae didn't move, didn't blink. Sat perfectly still with his hands on the table and his face giving away nothing. The way it always gave away nothing. Then he stood. He walked around the table, placed his hand on Junho's shoulder. Not a grip. Not a warning. Just a hand. Heavy and still. And he said, "You will leave tonight. I will not look for you. If I see your face again, I will not be this man." That was it. No bullet. No basement. No blood on the floor. Junho was exiled. Alive. Gone by morning. Down the hall, in a back room of the same restaurant, Yuna and Dong-sik waited. They had expected an order. A body to move. A name to erase. When Min-jae walked out alone, jacket buttoned, face unreadable, and said only, "It's done. He's leaving." The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was shock. Because in their world, a world built on consequences that never bent, what Min-jae had just done was unthinkable. Mercy wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a message. It was a crack in the foundation. And every person in that hallway knew it. But no one said a word. Because the man who had just chosen mercy was still the most dangerous person in the room. And the look in his eyes, quiet, steady, and absolute, made it clear that this was not weakness. It was a decision. And it was final. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice. Calm, clipped, professional. She said a man wanted to meet me. She said it wasn't a request, but I could refuse. She said he would be at the bench by the lakefront path at Montrose Harbor, Saturday, 10 in the morning. She said I would not be in danger. And then she hung up before I could ask a single question. I almost didn't go. I stood in my apartment that Saturday morning with my coat half on, one hand on the door handle, and every instinct I'd built over 28 years telling me to lock the deadbolt and stay inside. But something else. Something quieter. Something that had been growing since the night of the explosion. Told me I already knew who it was. And that not knowing the rest would eat me alive. So I went. He was already there, sitting on the bench in a dark coat, hands in his lap, staring at the water like it owed him something. No security that I could see, though I'm sure they were somewhere, watching from a car or a path I couldn't spot. He looked smaller without the restaurant around him, without the men, without the suit jacket buttoned tight like armor. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a long time. I sat on the far end of the bench, left a full body's width between us. Didn't speak. Waited. He didn't look at me when he started talking. He kept his eyes on the lake. Gray that morning. Flat. The kind of water that mirrors nothing. And spoke in a voice I had never heard before. Not cold. Not commanding. Just tired. Stripped down to something underneath the man I'd served dinner to. He told me 3 things. The first, he was the man I'd saved. I knew that. I nodded. He nodded back. A formality. A clearing of the throat before the real conversation. And the second, my mother, Grace Thompson, had spent 11 years raising a girl named Yoon Soo-ah. My breath stopped. He said Soo-ah married him when she was 24, that she was kind, that she was stubborn, that she died of lymphoma 6 years ago, and that Grace Thompson's hands had shaped the woman he loved before he ever knew her. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed around a name I hadn't said out loud in 16 years, but it came out anyway. A whisper, barely a sound. Soo-ah. He nodded. Once. And I saw his jaw tighten, the only crack in the stillness. The third thing. He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the bench between us. Not thick, not heavy. Just a plain white envelope, slightly creased at the corner. He said he had established a trust, not in his name, not connected to his world in any way that could be traced. The trust was for my child, education, housing, medical care, from birth through college, everything. I opened my mouth to refuse, to argue, to say I didn't need his money. I didn't need anyone's money. But he raised one hand. Slight. Not forceful. Just enough to say, "Let me finish." He told me the envelope was not the trust paperwork. That would come later, through lawyers I would never need to meet. The envelope was a letter. He had called his daughter for the first time in 3 years. They had been estranged. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. He called her and asked one question. "What would your mother have wanted me to do?" his daughter wrote back. By hand. And her answer was inside the envelope. He was now sliding toward me across a park bench, while the lake sat gray and still before us. I picked it up, opened it, unfolded a single page of handwriting, neat, careful, the kind of penmanship that comes from someone who was raised to take letters seriously. I won't tell you what it said. That belongs to me, and to Soo-ah's daughter, and to the mother neither of us got to keep long enough. But I will tell you this. By the second paragraph, I couldn't see the words anymore. The page blurred, my hands shook, and a sound came out of me that I didn't recognize. Low, broken, animal. The kind of grief that has been sitting in your chest so long, it doesn't even know it's grief until someone opens the door. I cried, not gracefully, not quietly. I cried the way you cry when someone finally sees the thing you've been carrying alone, and instead of looking away, they say, "I know. I see it. You can put it down." Min-jae did not comfort me. He didn't reach over, didn't touch my hand, didn't say it would be okay. He just sat there, on his end of the bench, hands in his lap, eyes on the water, and he let me fall apart. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood, maybe better than anyone, that some grief doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs a witness. We sat like that for a long time, me sobbing, him still. The lake between us and the city behind us, and the ghosts of 2 women, my mother and his wife, hovering somewhere in the gray autumn air, close enough to almost touch. This was not romance. I need you to understand that. This was a debt that spanned 2 families, for 2 generations, and a kitchen where a black woman and a Korean woman raised each other's children and never imagined how far that love would travel. This was a violent man sitting on a bench, choosing to honor the soft things he had failed to protect. And it was the most speechless I have ever been in my life. 3 months later, on a Tuesday in January, my daughter was born. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, dark eyes, loud lungs, fists clenched like she arrived already ready to fight for something. I named her Grace, not because it was original, not because it was poetic, because it was my mother's name, and because my mother spent her life pouring into a family that wasn't hers by blood, believing that love doesn't check paperwork before it decides where to land. I wanted my daughter to carry that, to wear it every day. to grow into a name that meant something before she ever had to prove anything herself. I don't work at Hans Pearl anymore. I gave my notice 2 weeks after the bench. Mr. Park didn't argue. I think he was relieved. I had become a complication he didn't have the vocabulary for. I enrolled in a culinary program at Washburn, professional kitchen, knife skills, pastry, stock work, the fundamentals I'd been doing by feel since I was tall enough to reach Mrs. Yoon's counter. The trust covered tuition. It covered childcare. It covered the kind of breathing room I had never once in my life experienced. The terrifying, weightless feeling of not being one emergency away from ruin. I didn't see Min-jae again. I didn't try to. That wasn't the arrangement. There was no arrangement. There was a bench and a letter. I'm in a man who gave me back something my mother planted in someone else's house 30 years ago. That was enough. That was more than enough. But one evening in early spring, Grace was 3 months old, bundled in a second-hand stroller with a blanket my neighbor had knitted. I walked past Hans Pearl. I wasn't going there on purpose. The culinary school was 4 blocks east, and the lakefront path curved past the restaurant on the way home. I'd walked that route a dozen times without stopping. That night, I stopped. A black SUV was parked outside. New model. Tinted glass so dark it looked like liquid. Engine off. A driver in the front seat, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. I stood on the sidewalk across the street. I didn't approach. I didn't wave. I just stood there with my hand on the stroller, in looking at the car the way you look at a closed door that you know you'll never open again but can't quite walk past. Inside. And I didn't know this then. But the driver told me later, because the driver always told me later. Min-jae was in the back seat, reading a file, a pen in his hand, the same posture, the same stillness. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror and said quietly, "The woman is outside, sir." Min-jae's pen stopped. He didn't turn, didn't look out the window. A long pause, the kind of silence that has texture, that takes up space in a car the way smoke does. Then, "Is the child with her?" "Yes, sir." Another silence. Longer this time. The driver said he watched Min-jae's reflection in the mirror and saw something cross his face. Not quite an expression, not quite a thought. More like a current passing through water. There and gone. Then, so quietly, the driver almost missed it. Good. The SUV pulled away from the curb. Smooth, silent. The taillights slid down the street and turned a corner and disappeared into the city like they'd never been there at all. I watched it go. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stood there on the sidewalk with the stroller and the spring air and the sound of my daughter breathing, soft, steady, oblivious to everything. And I held her a little tighter. Then I kept walking. And somewhere in the city, behind tinted glass, inside a world I would never belong to and never wanted to, a dangerous man allowed himself, for one brief moment, to feel something he had buried a long time ago. Not love. He wasn't built for that anymore. Not redemption. That's too clean a word for a man with his ledger. Just the quiet, aching proof that he was still human. That somewhere, a child named Grace was breathing. And that was enough.